one, I know that you're drinking from the fire hose. You probably have a need for more colleagues you don't have. And so I just want to express my gratitude that anyone took time to join us today. And I hope I can be of use. Maybe I'll tell you a little bit about myself. Actually, Travis told you a lot, so I'll be quick on this. I am a serial public servant. And I share this just to give you context on what I'm sharing. I am the co-author with Hannah Schenk of a book called Power to the Public, which really allowed us to interview and dive into the experience of many people solving hard public problems. Can I just do a check and see, can you guys see the slides?
No, I can share, Tara, if you prefer. Okay, I can share my.
That would be great.
Okay,
That would be great.
do it now. Okay, you talk.
Okay. I am deeply, you can move maybe to the next slide, and maybe the next one.
Yes, sorry, give me a sec.
No worries.
Okay.
And one more. This is me. This is a former president making fun of my habit of over preparation. Provided him with way too much detail for a short radio call about Medicare and Medicaid services. And so I just want to say I've kind of walked in the shoes of what is the right amount to give your principal in order to have them know the topic. In general, I go for I'm never sad that I over prepared, but in this case, I did get really seriously made fun of. For 4 years of my life, I had the honor of serving in the White House, and then I moved on to the Office of Management and Budget. But today, next slide, I work on something called the New Practice Lab. Can move one more slide forward.
Absolutely.
It is a team of researchers and designers and engineers that's focused on helping families with young kids. And so I use a lot of the practices I'm going to describe
Sasha,
in my current
I'm
work.
hungry. Sasha, why did you bring
Sorry,
all this food?
Did I tell you?
Last night,
I never say anything like
Mona, you know God, when you go see the fucker,
I think we got
gonna seen you
one person
so
who might need
much,
to mute.
you're not gonna know left from right.
So this is us at the New Practice Lab. We do what I'm going to describe in some of these practices, and we do it in deep partnership with governments across the country. Next slide. We do a lot of work listening to advance it one more, that we center all of our work not always in a particular government program, but we try to pull up and ask what helps families with young kids thrive. These are some of the things we hear when we anchor into what would be a support that would give you agency? What would it feel like? What are you looking for? And we ladder all this work up. You can keep moving, that's great. We do sprints for governments trying to deliver programs that help families with young kids. And so just maybe moving on to the next slide. We do this by gifting kind of teams to government agencies that have a theory of how they could measurably improve the delivery of material benefits to families with young kids. And just to give you a sense about the scale that's possible when you do these lightweight teams, our work from just the last year, measured in a 3-year time horizon, will improve benefit delivery for 1.7 million families, 40% of whom are kind of the most vulnerable parents with young kids in the country. Next slide. That's enough about me. I wanted to just, before we jump into tactics and practices, pull up and kind of name why this is important. You may work on many things. I saw a number of folks from Health and Human Services and other technical agencies every year in the United States, billions of dollars in existing, already designed by state and federal legislature policies fail to reach millions of people. They're just too complex and they're too hard to use. These are just 3 examples of things I work on. where the scale is millions of people will miss a tax credit that's been designed for families with young kids. Next slide. And you can keep clicking through. You'll see across these headlines as they come in that new policies often fail in delivery, especially if technology is involved. And you can just keep clicking forward there. You know, I'm putting my own personal tragedy out here. You can see the gray hairs in my head mostly come from this first website launch. But no matter what policy is being delivered, often when technology is involved, the government has a very high percentage of failure. Keep moving through. And it doesn't matter if it's unemployment insurance, keep moving. You know, or paid family medical leave, which I partner with a number of states deeply closely on, or tax credits. Next slide. I want to just pause and say this really matters. I don't need to tell you guys. Next slide. It has the aggregate of the experience of failures with government are one component of what is eroding trust in government. I should know, if you look at this chart, which the Pew Charitable Trust has been analyzing trust in government since 1960, you can see key moments, big public events on this, and you can see the decline in trust. And I take this deeply to heart because the rollout of healthcare.gov was, at the time when I worked on it, the lowest moment in government trust in US history. It coincided with a government shutdown. So what we do and what the experience of government is matters. Next slide. I'm going to offer my own take, which is we aren't going to change the way people feel about government until people feel it's really working for them. And it's a tough, tough situation that many of us find ourselves in. Next slide. So today, we're going to talk about how we improve the experience of government. And I know this is if you probably wouldn't be in the cohort of Innovate US learning calls if this wasn't something that matters to you, but I'll just share a little bit from 3 areas. I teach a course at Georgetown in the public policy school that has a series of cases about leaders who failed and succeeded in making governments work. In the course of writing Power to the Public, we interviewed dozens of leaders and dug into their work, and especially focused on those who were doing the impossible and having impact in areas that were very struck. Preventing suicides, getting communities not just to reduce homelessness, but to get to zero homelessness, to transform, and I'll talk more about what Travis raised, government services when they feel really stuck. And when we found that leaders were having a profound success at something where everyone else was stuck, they were doing 3 things together. And we're going to talk about this in 3 individual segments today. As my co-author says, this isn't a choose your own salad. You need to do all 3, and it's the combination of them working together that we believe is a frequent cause of teams that are having immense success. Just one more reminder to keep folks muted. Okay, we're going to dive in. Design. So these are 3Ds. I've studied a bunch about adult learning, the adult brains, which for those of you who have kids are different from the kids' brains, which can almost magically soak everything up. We thought we'd simplify these practices. They can be called a lot of things, but when we talk about design, we talk about anchoring into the experience of those who you're serving. And so maybe I'll just start by telling a quick story which came across in the course of writing the book. So President Lincoln, who I adore, presided over a country of 31 million residents in the United States. And I would argue he was maybe the first president to conduct user research. I don't know if you've heard this story, but he would open the doors to the White House after his breakfast, not only to hear from government officials and members of Congress, but just literally to anyone. And it made his advisors insane. They thought it was a waste of his time, but he had this open pipeline to anyone who could come to petition him. And it was really important to his perspective. He carried this through to his work in the Civil War, where he, not very many miles from where I'm standing today, stayed in a cottage that was prior to Camp David, and the cottage at the time was a station for soldiers who'd come back from the front of the war. So in the evenings, he would play cards with the soldiers who were serving. And it really informed his perspective about the consequences of his actions as a leader. And I think our aim today, as the government has now grown 10 times to the size of the populace in Lincoln's time, is to shrink the distance between government's leaders and those that they serve. I'm going to talk a little bit about Sevilla. Sevilla, or I was like, do we have any Michiganders here? Sevilla is a nonprofit based in the state of Michigan. And I think they're one of the most compelling examples of taking design to the center and anchoring into a root problem by big listening. So going back now a little over a decade, what you see here depicted in this picture on the left rolled up is the DHS 1171. It was at the time one of the longest forms in the United States for benefit assistance. It was the form for multiple types of benefits at once, whether you needed health care or housing assistance or cash assistance. It was a combination of state and federal programs. It had over 1,200 questions, and on average took an applicant over 2 hours to complete. And this form was ostensibly the front door, the welcome mat to the government when you were in an emergency and needed help. In 2011, Michael Brennan, who was at the time the CEO of the United Way of Southeastern Michigan, came across this form. It was a footnote in a report he had commissioned. And he printed it out, which took a lot of pages, and he rolled it up, and he became obsessed with it, carrying it with him whenever he made speeches for the United Way. And he was somewhat haunted by this form as just an artifact of what government help looks like. And he quit his job and he went out on a walkabout to the Stanford D School, where he met research designers and shared the form and started working on it. And they moved back with kind of no funds, but just a vision, and started what would become Sevilla, a nonprofit design studio. And they did research on the form. They interviewed people who used it. They, using Michael's connection, interviewed people who were frontline adjudicators, and they did kind of statistical analysis about the form, its questions, which were really inhumane. It included questions like the date of your child's conception and asked if there might be multiple fathers, which doesn't even make any sense. One researcher told me about how the users she was interviewing, and they just spent time in people's homes, felt like they needed to defend their life choices to the government, why they went to college and other things. The other thing that they found was there was really no difference between people who made it through the form process and people who got stuck on the outside. The team at Sevilla did a super unusual thing. They did not write a memo or create a deck. They asked for a meeting with some of the state's most senior officials. And when they showed up for the meeting, they recreated the experience from their research of what it was like to be in a benefits office in Michigan and fill out this form. This is very bold. Can you imagine? Sometimes I can't, but I like to really think this is what we need to make the kind of change we need. They had created the sound of an office, so children crying and ambient noise. They handed the forms to the Michigan officials and just said at the top of the meeting, you have 15 minutes to complete this form. And they didn't provide enough pens and they didn't provide enough chairs. All things they found from their research of actually what it was like to apply from this. The officials were stunned, but followed through. And after 15 minutes, they walked the officials through ostensibly a museum of their user research. And by the end of this meeting, the officials agreed to start a process that would redesign this form. It would last 813 days, but at the end, this new form, which you see on the right, was 80% shorter and could be processed in half the time. Most users now complete the form in 20 minutes. The teams engaged the staff of the Michigan benefits offices, and they were part of the process of the rollout. It is really an unbelievable success story that started with anchoring into the lived experience of what it's like to fill out this form. Next slide. I'm going to move off of design, starting and ending with root problems and people, onto data. Most modern companies use data to stay connected to their customers, to learn their habits and improve sales. Anyone who uses the internet experiences the constant tracking and gathering and analyzing and testing. And products, which are really huge data decision-making teams. Even something as simple as selling a cup of coffee, my research for the book brought me deeply down the data behind Starbucks. I just want to stop for a moment, and we have a quick poll, I believe, about how people use data in their own teams. So, do you gather data on your program performance? Yes, no? Give it a minute. I'm going to take some notes. Okay. I'm going to end the poll. Next question. Can you guys see the results?
Yes, we can.
Great. And I've got one more data question before we jump back in. This one's a little harder. If you use data, do you use data to change what you decide on doing? I gave you very binary choices, Tina, so it depends. It's fine. I should have given a C, maybe. Great, sometimes. If you feel free to just pop sometimes into the chat if don't mind my data construction was very binary. I welcome all chat commentary about data and how you use it. All right, I'm going to stop this poll and note this is like a kind of outstanding group in terms of data use. A lot of my own experience has been that we gather a lot more data than we put to use in deciding, or that we have like death by dashboard occasionally, where the level of effort to the level of using data to really change action is not always what I'd love to see. I'm going to give you another example about data. Maybe next slide. There's all kinds of data. Just moving on for this image of a cockpit. There's all kinds of data, and you do need, across our work, long lead data, one slide back, long lead data and short lead data. And I like this image of a cockpit because I think it gives you that if you had too many fields in the dashboard of a cockpit, it would be, it could be overwhelming, right? You need kind of like speed, direction. I'm not a pilot, so those of you who are, don't be offended by my slaughtering what cockpit data is. But overall, if you make a 2% adjustment in flying from New York City to LA, you end up in New Mexico. And so you need good enough data that you can see in real enough time. If the data came a quarter later, it doesn't help you fly a plane. And so thinking about what is your project relative to the project of flying a plane, and what is the minimum amount of good enough data you can have to keep you on course. And Jennifer Palka, who I love from formerly of Code for America, is the first person to, I think, use this cockpit analogy. She describes it as much of what we do in the public sector is like being asked to fly a transcontinental flight with only after the fact unreliable estimates of airspeed and altitude. And I love this, and I think, it's easy to kind of order up all kinds of data, but I'd often encourage teams, especially if you're working on something that is has a public-facing benefit, to have good enough data to take action. Next slide. We've previewed this. What is this? Guys, it's a rat. And this brings us to our next poll, which is just for fun. The next poll is about the top cities in the United States with the biggest rat challenges. Give it a go. It's open-ended. Okay, time for the big reveal. Okay, I think we have some winners here. The number one city, according to one data set, is Chicago, followed by Los Angeles, New York, San Francisco, my hometown of Washington, D.C., Denver, Colorado, Philadelphia, Detroit, Baltimore, and Cleveland, Ohio. And I thought, for the purposes of we don't need to talk that much about rats, I would cut it short. And why am I talking about rats in the context of design and data and delivery? I have a really, I think, important story about data, its complexity, that I want to share. And I thought by searing an image of rats into your brains, that may help us. So rats, this is where the story begins and ends. In research for the book, we came upon a really interesting study about a city attempting to do which many of these cities need. In 2017, and this problem persists in New York City, the city decided to bulk up their longstanding fight against rats. They did so by tapping into a 311 call center data, and the team basically that was planning on elevating and escalating rat abatement tried to use data to pinpoint where the worst problems were in the city and target their efforts there. But when the chief analytics officer at the time in the mayor's office of data and analytics, MODA, Amin-Ra Mishariki, took a look at the data, he was confused. He'd grown up in the Bedford-Stuy section of Brooklyn, and he had a memory of rats in that part of the city. And so he did what any person who looks at data does. He went and looked at the zip codes he was familiar with, where he grew up, where his family was. And he was surprised that according to the data, there wasn't much of a rat problem in Bed-Stuy. No matter which way the team looked at it, it kept showing very few rats in the neighborhood he was familiar with. And so in the spirit of design, he called up an old friend who lived in the projects he grew up in and asked, hey, what's happened to all the rats? According to the city's data, he explained, there were no more rats there. And his friend laughed and said, of course, there's plenty of rats here. So he asked, then why doesn't anyone call 311 to complain? And his friend said, what's 311? And so at the moment, Amin-Ra realized that this single source use of data for the city's planning to spend millions of dollars, one was, the more you dig in, 311 has really has challenges in being data that represents everyone. Not everyone uses 311. It often falls along as high use in neighborhoods that are upper income and white. And so one, the idea that you get a full picture of a problem so through a single data set was troubling. I tell this story because it also illustrates the importance of validating not only where your data comes from, but also that having data stewards who understand the places and people in the data sets matter. You know, had Mishiriki not grown up in New York or in the neighborhood he did, he wouldn't necessarily have been able to identify the gaps in the rat data. And so this element of using data needs to be qualified, checked with the human experience, and also checked on the sourcing, especially if it's directing your flight from coast to coast. Next slide. I'm going to move off of data and talk about delivery. And what do we mean when we say delivery? It's really shorthand for us in a number of practices that are not necessarily new. You could call it the scientific method. You could call it, as I'm sure the team in Oregon does, the agile practices. Something where you start, identify a problem, try a solution, and adapt along the way to make improvements. And so this practice of delivery, of really getting into the implementation and improvement sciences, is a key part of having success. But in my government experience, people overthink the policy and underthink the delivery. You can advance the slide one, please. And so it looks a little bit like this. Lots of regs, then a miracle occurs, and moving on. And so I want to break up and tell you kind of another story from our cases about delivery. Next slide. And I decided for this to share directly some slides from Beth Sander and the community solutions team, rather than taking my words for it, just as you should go watch the video from Sevilla that's in the chat. The team at Community Solutions is a nonprofit that's focused on homelessness. Next slide. They're dozens of years old. Originally, they started in the 90s with housing. Their answer to homelessness was to build housing. Next slide. And you can see beautiful buildings they built in New York. They built a lot of buildings. And they built community for people who lived in these buildings, no longer experienced homelessness. Next slide. But what they did find almost a decade later was outside their buildings, there were people who were lying on the streets. And so they started to get curious and interview them, why they were there. And what you see here on this slide is they ran through the lived experience of a number of folks unhoused in New York City. And this kind of chutes and ladders board was the steps it required once you had been cleared for housing. This is kind of I'm not going to take you through every step, but this is what they built on the basis of interviewing people and really identifying. On average, it was taking 300 days and 47 steps for people to move from the street into housing. And this was only if you could navigate the appointments, paperwork, and general hoop jumping that was part of this process. And so often, no one really does this mapping. You know, you hear from CBOs that it's not working, but having a kind of visualization. So next slide. Their process from listening to people brought them to folks like Ed. They went and in 2010, they launched an initiative called the 100,000 Homes Campaign, designed to learn about the experience who were unhoused and to identify what their barriers were and move them along. Next slide. In 4 years, 186 communities housed over 105 people, many like Ed, who just a year later moved from really unreliable housing to housing. The way they did this was a combination of data and delivery. In a given place, they interviewed people and understood what their challenges were, and they tried to match them to housing. Next slide. The 100 Homes campaign was met. They had picked this data-oriented goal, and they got above it. However, at the same time that 100,000 people were housed, the rate of homelessness was rapidly rising. And so they realized they picked the wrong target. And in the spirit of iterating and designing, they didn't just go and do another 100,000 homes. They went back to the drawing board. It was at this point that they decided the housing goal didn't make sense. They needed to focus on a different target, the goal of getting to zero. And so they set about a course of pilot cities that wanted to try to pick a category of homelessness, veterans homelessness, family homelessness, and get not more people housed, but get to zero. Getting to zero meant they had to build a database of who was housed in a given community. And that meant bringing a bunch of people together. Police had a set of data, hospitals had another set of data, shelters had another set of data, but often they didn't have a clear picture of who was unhoused and what were the barriers. The barriers to housing the first person and the last person were very different. And so part of the big effort of getting to zero, which they've now done in dozens of communities, was first about creating data across organizations that didn't exist in any given one organization. Second, it was about really being curious about the humans in a place and what their personal barriers were. Maybe it was about drug habits. Maybe it was about work. Maybe it was about the distance of the place that they lived from the family members they were caring for. And so working through the real lived experience allowed them to know what were the target interventions. I'm going to wrap here on my 3 key areas. Next slide. But I want to say one thing about the brilliance of Built for Zero and Community Solutions. They used data, they used design, they iterated on their process, but they also ultimately fell in love with the problem, not with a very specific solution, not an app, not a data dashboard, not a particular community. And at every given turn, they got more curious about why something wasn't working, and they didn't let their existing organizational capacity or their existing partners prevent them from getting to something like zero. They move from aspiring to do a little bit better to really fix things. So next slide, I'm just going to wrap up and say 3 parts: design, starting and ending with the humans to help identify the problem you're really solving for. Second, data doesn't have to be perfect, good enough to steer data. And checking your data with your human sources and making sure that the folks who are using and analyzing data aren't too far from the people in the data sets. And third, kind of iterative delivery. Trying things, fixing them, which I know is way easier to say than do in government cultures that can sometimes be really risk adverse with good reason. I'm going to open this up to questions and say we need to try things and fix them on the basis of what's working. It isn't about having a specific answer. It's about teams and cultures and organizations that can try things and learn and adapt. You can pull down the slides now. Thank you so much for helping me with them. And I want to just open it up to questions and hear what resonates here, what doesn't resonate, what experiences you have with this, and just to thank you for your time and say, as a serial public servant, I just aim to be of use and support with our teams at the New Practice Lab, but also in the practices and learnings of what of the scars and experience I have, but I'm curious about yours. Maybe I'll open it up.
Okay, we are opening the Q&A session. So I know Michael Baskin is here in the audience. So Michael, I know you have a question for Tara, so I don't know if you can unmute and make the question, or if not, we are starting with other questions before. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Tara, thanks. The piece that you put out before the book was really powerful to so many of us in local government. And I'm curious about what you think the organizational forms are that allow full organizations to move into design, data, and delivery. What are the practices and what are the steps that you see people taking to get there?
Thank you so much. And I don't think it looks the same everywhere. No one knows better than each of you about where the space is, but maybe I'll share a few lessons which come from the interviews of folks who succeeded and failed. First, we do make the case in the book that you can't do this without support from the top. And so I think one of the brilliant aspects of Michael's experience was you can't do hard things differently. No one goes into government for like the fame or certainly for the money. But, often you're in a scenario where it feels like, and I had this a lot with healthcare, where it's like, this isn't good enough, but I don't see a way of like getting out of where we are. Sometimes you have to have your leaders have the experience that's almost jarring, like filling out a form that they're responsible for and finding it just impossible. And so I would really encourage, when you have new leadership or old leadership or just opportunities to just do the walk in the shoes piece for leaders. I'll give you one example. In the peak of COVID, when we were writing the book, we spoke to basically the German equivalent. I read a story in the Times that had people just like glowing about their experience with COVID benefits. And I was like, I would like to talk to these people. And it was a city in Germany who had provided benefits for gig workers very quickly. And I kind of got myself up the food chain to basically an undersecretary of the Treasury in Germany and interviewed him and said, like, how did you come to this? Like, this is amazing. People are writing like affirmative, saying joyful things about a experience with COVID benefits, which was not what we were necessarily having at the time. And he said, I looked at the form, which to me was interesting. I was like, what kind of, almost Treasury Secretary equivalent was looking at the form. And he was like, and every week I get the calls from the call center. And so I was listening to the calls, the transcript of the calls from the call center. It's very fascinating. And he said, when I looked at the form, I thought, are we going to crash our economy because we can't trust people? This is too complicated. We'll create a place where if you didn't deserve the money, you could send it back. People should self-attest. We were asking them to measure their apartments and these complicated things. And so he just sort of almost had an instinctual, based on data, but lightweight data, transition. And so I love that. I think many, many agencies have call center data that is not part of a standing meeting on a monthly or weekly basis for your senior executives. How can you take what you already have of qualitative data that's coming in somewhere that you're paying a third-party vendor for and make it visible for process improvement? So this is a long-winded answer, but support from the top really matters. Support from the kind of field really matters. The brilliance of Seville's work was they built it with the field leaders who were not feeling great about the experience they were delivering to their clients. And so really getting curious, what, very recently, one of the Social Security administrators in his first round went out and did a set of listening tours in the call centers and with ride-alongs with frontline workers in the Social Security agency. And he just asked, hey, it seems like it's taking you a while there. Is there something, if you had a magic wand, what would you do with this form? And one official said to him, like, if I know someone isn't income eligible, I still have to click income not eligible 38 times on this form. And if I could just have a no to all button, that would change my life. Within 8 weeks, having an administrator who's out in the field and understanding the burden, when the code was released for the no to all button, it made the workers feel seen. It decreased minutes on every application for review. Some of this you don't necessarily have to have, Michael, in residence data scientists. There's a lot of latent data in the system that's just not visible to the people who could make a difference. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. I have a question from Mara.
Yeah.
Any suggestions on further research to help with falling in love with the problem versus the solution? I think our teams often want to jump immediately to brainstorming solutions.
I don't know if you guys have ever done some of these strength finder tests, but there is one that is like archetype problem solver. And I'm going to just, further a guess that maybe a lot of folks on the call today fall into that problem solver type. And so it's really easy to jump to the end thing, but very often it's the first thing is not the right thing. So one is there's a methodology that folks may be familiar with called the 5 whys, where it can be really helpful in a meeting context. And I can send some more links to this if it's useful, but there's a number of kind of management tools where you ask why over and over again. And so when you get to like, why aren't people housed? They don't have houses. Why aren't there enough houses? And you kind of like run it to ground. And I do think at varying points, and if you're really problem solving, often you need to solve one thing to find out what the next thing to solve is. And so 5 whys is oh great, thank you so much, Michael. Is something I found useful, not in all contexts, but again, it's like pretty straightforward. The other piece is this is for those of you guys who are managers, this is a place to really check. It's so easy to get momentum. But very rarely is a new technology going to solve something that's an intractable and complex problem. And very often, we write about this in the book, modernizing something or just digitizing something without understanding what problem you're really solving for can make things a lot worse. And so I really think it's important to slow down, think about what problem you're really solving for and what's in your power.
Great, thank you so much. There's a comment/question by Bonnie that say, this sounds so simplistic, but it's all about connection. I mean, I think
I think that's really true, and I'm happy to kind of dig in, make sure I'm answering all these questions. I think that connection, kind of in that category of the public trust data I showed you, is one of the biggest challenges of our time. And it could, for those of us who are like water experts or working on healthcare or working on transportation, kind of filtering down to something that may seem like obvious and basic, could turn heads. But ultimately, in the US today, we're at a very statistically low point of connection. And so that's particularly true for institutions. And it isn't just the government. If you work as a journalist or you work at a bank, our institutions, we hit in that data in 1965, had a massive drop after Nixon's resignation. And we became a low, we were in what would be technically a low trust society. And so any way that you can revive connection through your work, that could be just within your team and your staff. And in the times we live in, it's really hard and challenging to be a public servant. People are incredibly critical. If you're a client, you can understand that because the experience of many of these services and the qualitative work we do really is dehumanizing. Not necessarily on purpose. It's just, as Sevilla found with the form, they got those questions over the course of 30 years and nobody thought when they added one to take one away. It isn't necessarily bad intent. It just kind of gets that way over time. So I really appreciate that. And I think holding connection as a kind of central value for the folks in your teams and also for your citizens is incredibly important.
Thank you so much. There's a comment from Michael saying, we love Denver's motto of no new budget, no new people, and no new technology to help folks step out of those obvious solutions so that they can iterate on solutions that help them to more deeply explore the challenge.
I see also another question of where to start on design and data, but can I do one? Oh wow, we have a bunch of questions. I didn't want to miss them.
Absolutely.
One quick story on technology. Marina Nitza, who is a chief technology officer and responsible for a huge transformation in the VA, went to Rhode Island to work on foster care. And in her analysis, she was there to build a tool for matching potential foster families with kids. And she did a little digging. She got everyone from every part of the process into a gym, like high school gym, I think, one weekend, and found that, the process was somewhat sequential. So if you timed out while you were getting your fire extinguisher, then you ended up back in line. And one aspect she found was that the process was paper-based and that people constantly lost the second page. And so her big innovation that dramatically increased correctly filled out forms was a staple. They started stapling those 2 pages together before they handed them out in the child welfare offices, and it made numerical difference. And so it isn't always like a new technology. It might just be a staple. I'm going to just group the questions and do them. Where to start, data or design? And also, how do you balance new tools or processes that simplify and standardize versus delegating decision-making authorities? I'd love, David, if you had a moment to say more, how do you balance new processes that simplify versus delegating decision-making authorities. This is kind of a balance between decision-making at a kind of field level or collective, everyone has to go through this. Am I capturing, give me a thumbs up or hop off mic if I'm capturing that question correctly.
Yes, yes. And sorry, I'm coming from USAID, so work is probably a little bit less directly applying this than some of the folks on this call. But we've done a lot of research in supporting kind of social accountability in frontline workers, and it feels like there's a tendency to want to say, hey, let's cut through the red tape with a new standardized form and kind of centralizing. But there's a lot of research that actually better outcomes come from saying like, well, let's see how much we can free up the principals of the school to decide what makes sense within certain parameters around how they're going to run or manage processes, even if that's then harder to aggregate or not the same everywhere. And I'm just wondering if you can speak to that